Hello and welcome to the fourth webinar. Global problems require global solutions, rethinking tourism. For today's discussion, we have three internationally renowned professors who are experts in the field of tourism, sustainability, and strategic risk management. Let me introduce you to them. Firstly, we have Professor Sonia Khan from the HP University in Shimla, all the way from India. Welcome to our webinar, Sonia.
Thank you so much.
Could you please briefly introduce yourself to our audience? Thank you,
Yes.
Sonia.
I am Sonia Khan. I am a professor of tourism in India, HP University, Shimla. Besides India, I have done some teaching abroad. I have taught 2 years in Cyprus at an American university. I have taught 1 year in Malaysia, and I have done 2 years of online teaching for university, Royal Roads University in Canada. My interests are consumer behavior and international tourism. So that's from me, Gina.
Thank you so much. And our second presenter is Professor Noel Scott, all the way from Australia, from the University of the Sunshine Coast. Hello, Noel.
Hello, and thank you for the invitation. I'll speak louder because I'm such a long way away from everyone. I work at, I'm a professor of tourism management, and I work at the University of the Sunshine Coast. I've had a sort of a long history, both in business generally, as well as more recently in tourism, working for the Australian or Queensland government, and then as an academic. So I'm an old man, and I'm very interested to be here to talk about this topic. Thank you.
Thank you, Noel. And our third panelist is Professor Alexandros Paraskevas from the University of West London in the UK, who lives in the same city like me, Oxford. Hello, Alex.
Hello, Eugenia. Hello, everybody. I'm really pleased to be here. As Eugenia said, I am a professor in strategic risk management, and I'm the director of a center that we have at the University of West London for hospitality and aviation resilience management. As the title suggests, I'm very interested in risks. I'm studying risks and crisis. I have, like Noel and Sonia, industry background. I worked with Marriott for about 15 years before becoming an academic. I'm quite an industry based, let's say, or originated from the industry academic. And I'm really glad that I'm here to share some thoughts with you.
Thank you, Alexandros. Our topic today considers how, of course, to prepare for tomorrow. COVID-19 threatens the devastation of humanity and the stability of the global economy. It demands immediate global actions, a rethink of risk management strategies in tourism, and of course it requires a rapid communication responses from governments. It requires transparency, respect, and trustworthy news. Problems involved in containing the virus are truly daunting. Some claim that things will work out in the end, and others argue that no one can calculate change. Our world has become, however, a single place, and hence global problems require global solutions. We can no longer leave such problems to the markets alone. We need to involve all the stakeholders if we are to achieve a world that mixes stability, equity with prosperity. Panelists will discuss issues on global problems require global solutions in the management of the industry, tourism industry. Just a little reminder to all of you, at the end of the presentations, we will do the Q&A with our experts. If you would like to submit questions for the panelists, please use the Q&A button on your screen. We will do our very best to answer as many questions as we can in the time provided. Sonia will now open the discussion with the current situation caused by COVID-19. Over to you, Sonia. Thank you.
Thank you, Eugenia. Here I go. All right. And I'll start with my presentation. Sorry, just a minute. Yes. We all know the topic, that is global problems require global solutions, rethinking tourism. And I'm going to start again. Now, largely what we are talking about today is in response to the situation that has befallen the globe in the form of COVID-19, and it does require global solutions. And we see that before I start with COVID, I'll just make a mention of a number of global problems that time and again have befallen our Earth, which are terrorism, climate change, poverty, sustainability, natural disasters, epidemics, and pandemics. And every time the world has had to get together to resolve these problems because they are transnational problems. They transcend national boundaries. And now what COVID has done to the whole globe is it has brought the world to a grinding halt. And all the economies, all the countries around the world are suffering on account of this global problem. To deal with all these problems, we already see the role of United Nations, which we have seen in dealing with these problems primarily through the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, which largely cover all the problems that I have mentioned here. However, specifically, the United Nations has its own offshoot agencies that time and again are dealing with these problems, and I've mentioned a few here. You talk about the Security Council, which is dealing with terrorism. Then the United Nations itself is dealing with the climate change and sustainability problems. The poverty is being dealt with the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, then the World Health Organization itself. And all these problems somehow have some kind of relevance, or we could say some ripple effect on tourism industry, whereby the global nature of the organization UNWTO comes into view. And UNWTO here is at the helm of affairs when we come to the tourism industry in dealing with such global problems. So the need to deal with all these problems is to move on from unilateralism to multilateralism, and to move on from individual efforts to a collective efforts, because these are global problems, they cannot be resolved at national levels. Now here again, why do we need global solutions is something that I'm talking about. Now, as early as 30th of January, it was declared by the United Nations and the World Health Organization about COVID-19 that it is a public health emergency of international concern. When it already said international concern, then we got to know that, of course, it is a global problem. And it has now taken up the form of a pandemic because since January, it has spread like wildfire throughout the countries. The need for global solutions is, how is it this COVID problem affecting the industries, the countries? Now, this COVID is having a ripple effect throughout the industries, throughout the nations, and internationally as well. And there has been a complete collapse of the direct and the indirect supply chain in the tourism industry. So we need to deal with the ripple effect of this COVID problem throughout the world. Secondly, we need to deal with this in a global manner to share resources. Now, we do know that no country in itself can boast of being completely self-reliant in terms of dealing with any problem. And we are seeing this in terms of COVID as well. So there is a need to share resources when dealing with such kind of a problem. Infrastructure resources, financial resources, and expertise, which we are, of course, seeing presently in the form of sharing of medicine, sharing of vaccination, PPEs, rapid testing kits, and we are also taking some kind of financial aid from the World Bank, the IMF, and expertise, where we are taking in the expertise of known doctors and physicians to develop some kind of vaccine to counter this problem. Thirdly, why do we need a global solution to maintain equilibrium in the globe? We are all varied countries around the globe, developing countries, developed countries, underdeveloped countries. Every country is faced with its own problems. Now, if we have to deal globally with a problem, and if we have to do some kind of justice and equity, we need to remove this disparity between nations, and we should join in our efforts together to deal with such kind of problems. And lastly, to ensure the survival of humanity and the planet, because we owe it to God, our humanity and the planet, and we are together responsible for protecting and sustaining it. Now, the areas of concern with regard to tourism that I will be talking about one by one, taking it as a global problem, this COVID, are mentioned here, and I'll start with the first one. The first need is to deal with health and safety concerns globally and being united. Now, what I just heard half an hour back, I was watching BBC News, and I heard it was the first news of BBC, which said that the United Nations Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, he just mentioned it, and he was quite critical of the fact that we have seen an extreme lack of international cooperation in dealing with these problems. And it has become an issue of powers between China and United States. Unfortunately, this is very sad. This is a global health problem. It needs to be dealt with common rules and regulations. Hereby, we can take maybe the World Health Organization at the helm of affairs as a global agency, and WHO has already started dealing with this problem, taking an initiative as early as January by propagating or by making aware people of certain hygienic rules and of social distancing as well. Secondly, with regard to health and safety, we see that if there is international cooperation, it should be done in an ethical manner. Sharing of resources, expertise, equipment, whatever it is. What we are seeing now after 3 months, when this problem has started surfacing in many other nations which cannot cope with it, they are asking for medical equipment and vaccines, but many countries, unfortunately India also, was supplied recently faulty rapid testing kits. So if we are not ethical in our concerns of survival of humanity, unfortunately, it's going to be very sad. We have to come up together in an ethical manner to deal with this problem. Thirdly, with regard to health and safety concerns, travel and safety rules in the interest of tourists and local communities, entry regulations, insurance, vaccination. Now, these rules must be now decided by the UNWTO and the national governments together, which are members of the UNWTO, so that we can decide how travel is going to go on in future, keeping in view the safety and security of the tourists, where they are traveling to, which communities they are going to, and how are the businesses maintaining the health and safety regulations. Second concern with regard to COVID and tourism, rethinking tourism, is labor and humanitarian concerns. Incidentally, today is the World Labor Day. And I do not know what to say, because it's very sad also. The condition that we are seeing of labor throughout the world today is really appalling. And it's really heart-wrenching. On account of COVID, what we have seen is mass unemployment. Now, not only in the tourism sector, because tourism in itself is not an entity. Tourism is made up of supplementary sectors. It is related in any way and every way to all other industry, government departments, sectors, whatever. So mass unemployment throughout the supply chain has directly affected the tourism industry. And UNWTO has, there have been thousands of layoffs in the tourism industry directly and indirectly in the other related sectors. Tourism employs more than 330 million people around the globe. But this problem of COVID has brought everything, it had stalled all the industry operations and many people have been laid off. UNWTO has already said that mere words are not going to help. We will need to save jobs of people. So we need to have some labor concerns in terms of maybe in future developing some kind of labor protection laws, perhaps under the guidance of International Labor Organization. What we see in tourism is also, if we talk about the management pyramid, tourism industry jobs are largely concentrated in the middle and the lower level management. Unskilled and semi-skilled workers. And unfortunately, these are the major sufferers when it comes to jobs being laid off. So we have to protect them. Secondly, another problem is that tourism industry is largely dominated by the private sector enterprises. Now, private sector enterprises anyway do not offer job security. So in future, we would need to have some binding protection laws to protect the interests of the employees. Secondly, what has the unemployment done? It is leading to a huge mass reverse migration of diaspora back to their villages and the rural areas. Tourism industry is largely concentrated in urban areas. People come to work there in the industry. When jobs are gone, now they want to go back home and they're all walking back home. Unfortunately, in countries like India and Indonesia, we are seeing huge problems of masses of population trying to get home. Now, what started with a health problem is now turning into a socio-psychological emergency, I would say, in many countries. When people are not able to get home, all these workers, it is carving deep wounds of them in terms of starvation, suicides, anxiety, depression, and crime. Here again, now this is assuming the shape of a global problem in the terms that humanitarian concerns have come into view. And we need the active role of the UNHCR, the Human Rights Commission, to deal with such issues. Then thirdly is the industry commitment for corporate social responsibility and triple bottom line approach in tourism. What we see till now, we talk a lot about CSR and TBL and tourism and all other industries, but largely the concentration has been on saving the environment. So all we are talking about is environment and we just don't care about people. What this COVID-19 has done is it has reinforced the importance of people and lives. And saving lives and livelihoods, because if there is no life, there cannot be any livelihood. So we need to have more rigid accountability in future of businesses for protecting lives of people, accountability to employees, to local communities, and to consumers in terms of consumer protection. Secondly, we also see the role of social welfare role of tourism industry. In many ways, we are seeing this at a global level where tourism enterprises are coming to rescue and to help with the fighting this disease in terms of transport carrying. Now, we do not have commercial transport and operations any longer, but the aircrafts are carrying cargo, they are carrying medicine and the protection kits. We see the F&B sector, which is now giving out food packets to the people who are homeless and the needy. We see accommodation opening up its doors now in terms of turning it into quarantine centers. So that is something very good that we are doing at a global level. Thirdly is, of course, the other businesses which are helping in fighting this problem. A very good example is how within few days of the outbreak of the problem in UK, in London, the Excel Centre offered its premises for the establishment of the Nightingale Hospital. Now, the global agencies that come into view in terms of industry commitment for CSR, the Economic and Social Council, the World Tourism Organization, and the United Nations Industrial Development Organization. Then we come to industry survival in tourism. Yes, we need to protect jobs, but the problem is when the industries are not getting any business, it is very difficult for them to protect these jobs because they are not making any money. So, but tourism industry is not a standalone business. It is a composite of primary enterprises, secondary enterprises, government departments, supplementary industry. So financial support is needed in all sectors, directly and indirectly related, in the whole tourism supply chain. Then we need government, banking, and finance support, particularly for the small and medium-sized enterprises in tourism and hospitality industry. We need certain interest waiver policies on the loans that they are indebted with. We need to probably design a policy for future that they can get tax breaks in case such a calamity strikes and in case the businesses are grounded for a while. Lastly is thinking risk management strategies. We normally see our approaches, we think, oh, things are not going to happen to us. So we let things happen and then we are faced with the problem on how to deal with it. So what is happening is people, our businesses adopt a reactive approach. We need to shift this focus from reaction to being proactive in developing certain strategies for risk management. Then fifth is the force majeure situations in tourism. This is an ideal time. What COVID-19 has done is an ideal example of how the industries around the world are faced with the force majeure situations, unforeseen catastrophes that strike us from time to time. So for future, what we need to do is we have to have some rethinking in terms of reframing some kind of global policies for future businesses, tourism businesses, in terms of cancellation of tickets, bookings, insurance claims for tourists, refunds for their bookings, and compensation. Here again, transport, accommodation, travel agencies, and the events industry has to come into view because they all pre-book tickets. And now, of course, many are unable to refund the tourists, and some are saying that, okay, you can take vouchers for future use. But the sad part about it is, what if I had a conference in April? What am I going to do with the voucher? I don't want to travel in next year in April. So this is a big problem. How are we going to have such policies that can maintain consumer confidence? In this view, we can see the agencies coming into view that at a global level are, again, the UNWTO, the International Civil Aviation Organization, International Air Transport Organization, Cruise Line International Association, International Maritime Organization, and the online travel agencies and the other small travel agencies and businesses. Sixth is destination rebuilding in tourism. Now, what the present scenario on account of COVID is that all the countries have shut their borders in defense and to protect themselves from any outside importing of this disease. So presently, European Union has closed all its borders to external traffic and non-EU countries. We see even within the Schengen countries, though Schengen is together, a group of countries, they are limiting entry of people from certain countries. So how long can this carry on? For future, we will have to revise our strategies for visa rules, travel advisories that are issued by national governments and even by the WHO. Here again, the role of destination management organizations will come into view, and of the country unions, whether it is EU, Schengen, ASEAN countries, etc. At the moment, we have 96 countries which have completely closed their borders. We have 44 countries which are allowing traffic only from certain countries, and they're restricting others. So this is something that is going to be a big problem for tourism as and when we even start opening up our borders. Second is, how will we rebuild our destinations? We can do that again by fostering alliances. In future, we will need to have more marketing alliances, intersectoral in tourism, and we will need to maybe airlines tying up with hotel, the MNC hotel chains or the DMOs. We will need to do umbrella marketing. We will need to get the nations together to market each other, like is a practice very much in the ASEAN countries. If you're moving around in Thailand, you have the monorail going with a banner of Visit Singapore. So it is very interesting how they are cooperating, and we need to do that at a global level. Then is the global media initiative in tourism. Now, media has a big role to tackle any kind of global catastrophe or problem. And what the media needs to do, rethink for our future, is to provide balanced media coverage. We cannot have a biased media. We cannot have media blaming a particular country or a nation for this spread of the virus. So we need media to work in an unbiased manner and rebuild the confidence of consumers, rebuild the confidence of stakeholders who are in the supply chain of the tourism industry. Media strongly needs to counter misinformation. This, unfortunately, has come up as a big problem because of the COVID. Xenophobia. We cannot start hating tourists. We will have to let them in at some point of time. We cannot start racism or stigmatization and alienation of countries and people. We cannot say it is a Chinese virus. Sorry to say, but this is extremely wrong to point out that if it started in China, we cannot label it to a country. We cannot say that the virus is spreading on account of certain communities, which we are seeing in certain countries and even in India. This is a God-given problem, and it's his desire where it's going to happen. But again, we need to counter misinformation, and we need to be responsible in tackling this. And the media coverage should be unbiased. Here again, the media, the UNWTO, and the governments should come into view. Now, lastly, what are the major points of rethinking future tourism and the dilemmas? It is, you cannot, that there is no answer to it really. Now, we are thinking that already certain countries are underway in forming stringent rules for future safe travel. And I was just hearing about Greece the other day, that Greece is now thinking that it might introduce COVID immunity certificates before people travel into Greece. So maybe we would need immunity certificates. Maybe we would need vaccination before we start traveling in for future safe travel. But again, the dilemma here is the more stricter the rules are, the lesser the tourists would want to travel to those places. If somebody tells me that I have to go to Africa and if I have to take a number of vaccination, then I wonder, oh, who's going to bother about all that? That is very tedious. I would rather not go to a particular country, then I would rather go where it is easy to travel to. So stringent rules, how they're going to introduce them, and though of course they can protect our future, but to bring about stringent rules is going to be a very mammoth task. Secondly, introducing of a code of ethics for tourists, residents, and businesses. Tourists will need to be responsible. Now, what code of ethics? If countries are making masking mandatory, it's the responsibility of the tourists, residents, businesses, local communities to go with masks. If they are making social distancing mandatory for safety and security, then it is our responsible behavior to maintain social distance. The other day I heard in the news was that Sweden, they have had no lockdown. And how are they maintaining all this? And the answer that they give is so wonderful. They said, we expect it to be social responsibility. We are expecting our people to be socially responsible. This is amazing. And they said, we will deal with it. So they are now banking on herd immunity. And they said, so here again, we have to be responsible. And maybe some countries now in future, instead of targeting just anyone and everyone for profit, they will have to start targeting on educated tourists who understand the problem. So never mind if you lose out on profit, but you save humanity and you give a quality experience to tourists. Thirdly, selective tourism. In future, can we go in for selective tourism? Now, if countries are closing their borders, particularly if you talk about Europe, Europe has long landlocked countries. Now, selective tourism, if we say we do not want any international tourism, then we might have to go in for short-haul tourism. Can we restrict the markets whom we are going to deal with, whom we are going to send our tourists to? Can we restrict the markets who we are going to get tourists from? Now, China is the highest generator of international tourists throughout the world. If we are so much against China, are we going to close our doors to Chinese tourists, which are giving the maximum profit to us? So these are questions which are going to be very difficult to answer. And again, in Spain and Italy and France, the top 10 destinations, among the top 10 destinations of the world, we cannot close our business with these countries. We'll have to take our tourists there. The travel businesses, the travel agencies, they do need to. So how and when they're going to do it, with what rules, is going to be a very difficult task. And again, we see that probably in future, we're going to move in from group inclusive travel to the free independent travel, maybe in view of social distancing, then social distancing, now what is this? Is there something going to emerge like social distancing tourism? Is it viable? Now, it's not viable for businesses, definitely, because they cannot, compromise on profit. If you were saying social distancing tourism means limiting the number of tourists. Now, it's very hard for them to do this. And Ryanair has already said that it is not going to operate if they say you leave the middle seat free. So they are just going to ground their operations. So is it for certain countries and in Italy, I was seeing that the restaurants are now the restaurant operators are now handing over their keys. They are depositing their keys that we are not going to operate if you allow us to restrict the people coming in to the restaurants. So how are we going to make it viable? And when the core of tourism is socio-cultural interaction, it is impossible to have social distancing tourism. If people have to travel, they have to interact with local communities. There can be no tourism. You cannot have tourism in an environmental bubble of your own. So this is again going to be very difficult. Decongestion is going to come up from the prime urban areas where there is tourism, and maybe we now move on to building or identifying tourism and strict visitor management at visitor attractions, whether it is in the rural areas. And perhaps new forms of tourism are going to come in, like in the rural areas, handicraft tourism, creative tourism, horticulture, rural businesses. Something we'll have to do to decongest the urban areas that see tourism. Now, I'll just mention here the couple of global initiatives that have already been introduced around the world to deal with this problem. UNWTO has already asked the nations to place tourism at the center of national recovery, policy, and actions, and to build future resilience, so that now we should be preemptive in having risk management strategies rather than wait for a reactive approach. UNWTO and the whole World Health Organization together are now thinking of introducing public health measures to minimize disruption to travel and tourism, which will be very good for our industry. Thirdly, UNWTO has already urged the nations to lift travel and visa restrictions as soon as the situation starts easing in their countries. COVID solidarity response has already been set up by the World Health Organization to protect, fund, detect, and respond to this pandemic. And the best part is that the UNWTO has formed a tourism crisis committee with membership from United Nations agencies, private and government and international financing bodies, and heads of the UNWTO regional commissions. It's given 23 recommendations for coming out of this problem. And the broad three categories are mapping crisis and monitoring impact, which will be dealing with employment problems, taxes, regulations to the industry, and recessions that all the economies are going to face. Secondly, providing stimulus and accelerating recovery, financial aid to businesses, tax policies, lifting travel restrictions around the countries, restoring confidence of both the businesses and the consumers and the local communities as well. And lastly, preparing for tomorrow, building preparedness for the future. Don't wait for disaster to strike. It can happen anytime, and we are all vulnerable. It can happen to each one of us. So I will end with just a few statements that international cooperation is vital and indispensable to maneuver through this crisis and even to combat this crisis. United we stand, divided we fall. So we have to work in a global effort to come out of this crisis. Thank you, Eugenia.
Thank you, Sonia, so much. It's been really a fantastic presentation, very much enthusiastic and thought-provoking. Thank you so much. And our second presenter now is Professor Noel Scott. Over to you, Noel, when you're ready.
Thank you. And thank you, Sonia. It was a very interesting presentation.
Thank you,
I'm going to try and share my screen now. Let's see how I go. And I'll bring this up. So hopefully everyone can see that screen now.
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Good. Okay, well, so thank you. Some very thought-provoking ideas. I want to give you a little bit of information about the situation on the other side of the world, here in Australia, and then talk a little bit about some of the effects it's having on tourism, and then thinking a little bit about the future, as Sonia was saying, what do we do about all this sort of stuff? So I can't apologise, but Australia seems to be doing pretty well at the moment, compared, I suppose, to a lot of countries, and that's understandable because Australia is very large, but still an island. Our government was quite proactive in shutting borders. And in fact, I think I came back from overseas around about the 16th of March. And pretty soon after that, the Australian government closed borders so that people who were non-Australians, unless essential workers, were unable to come. The situation now is that we've had roughly 6,000 to 7,000 diagnosed cases, although, of course, the way this virus is working, there's a lot of people who aren't showing symptoms, and we've had about 89 deaths. So compared to a lot of countries, Australia, from a health perspective, from an effect on society's morbidity, if you like, or in a very good situation. On the other hand, from an economic perspective, a complete disaster. And we're going to, as I'll be talking soon, as I'll talk later, we're talking about government may be spending certainly in the hundreds of billions of dollars and perhaps $1 trillion, Australian dollars, in financial aid and support. So very tricky situation. Should we balance off the financial effects of a disease versus its health risks? Can you do that? I don't think I'd like to be able to do it, but we should recognize that there are risks from a downturn in the economics of a country, which will lead to flow-on health problems, and that's a problem that is coming up in the future. So Australia pretty much closed its borders from the 20th of March, and indeed since that time there have been restrictions at state borders. Pretty much we've been in what in Australia we called ISO, or isolation, and originally it was pretty firm. Now they're starting, the government is starting to allow people to move around for non-essential purposes. So I think from tomorrow we'll be able to visit national parks and actually travel up to about 50 kilometers for recreational purposes. So slowly, as the situation in Australia has become calmer, the health situation seems to be more manageable, the government has started to release its restrictions. That, of course, is leading to lots of debate as to the final exit strategy, as they talk. When will all restrictions be removed and going back to full travel? Well, international travel, probably at the moment, the talk is the end of the year, the end of 2020. Maybe that's too long, maybe that's too short. I think it more depends on the situation outside Australia's borders. Within Australia, it's likely that the state border restrictions will be removed probably in the next month or so, and thereafter there will be a continuing trickle of COVID diseases, but at least it will be manageable. The strategy of reducing the peak, as they say. Just as an aside, I want to draw your attention to why COVID-19 is so very different from other crises and major health risks that we've had in the past. So in my time, there's been a number of major health risks and other disasters in Asia and the Pacific region. We've had SARS, for example. We've had all sorts of terrible disasters like the tsunami in the Indian Ocean. So regular risks and their effects on tourism. But COVID's a little bit different in that it's global at one time. So the previous disasters and crises that we've had, for example, SARS, was mainly confined to China or Southeast Asia and wouldn't have had much effect in Europe or America. Ebola, for example, in Africa, Zika in South America. These are not things which have happened around the world, but COVID-19 has transmitted itself so quickly that all the major economies are being affected at once. So that's a different situation from the normal. It's not focused on countries of Southeast Asia, for example, which you might describe as low middle income countries. It's affecting developed Western countries in a very serious way, in fact, arguably worse than the developing countries. At the same time, interest rates are very low. So how do the governments recover? Can they stimulate growth by reducing interest rates? Well, it's going to be hard. So governments are seeking to spend money, I suppose, spend their way out of trouble. That will probably lead to, well, may lead to inflation. We'll see. I'm not an economist. Certainly the effect of COVID has been much more rapid because of the integration around the world and the effect of air travel. And that air travel is not just carrying tourists, but it's also carrying all sorts of highly valued goods. And the effect of COVID-19 is spilling over into transportation and logistics and moving food around and all sorts of things. So it's having effects throughout the supply chain. So it's a little bit different from the past. And I don't think we can rely simply on looking back and saying, here was the solution for SARS, therefore we can use those solutions. And certainly we shouldn't be looking at the timeframes from the past to see how long this thing will take to recover. Tourism arguably will recover. It's remarkable to me how resilient the tourism demand is. But in the past, that resilience has been partly because demand can be swapped to other parts of the world. That's not possible now. That is leading to a buildup of interest in future travel. So once restrictions are released, there will probably be a reasonably good recovery. But the downside of it is that the financial situation after the health problem is resolved, if it can be, is going to cause difficulties or there being less money for travel. So on one hand, demand will be building. On the other hand, demand will be decreasing because people won't have as much money to spend. So I think we can expect those people with money, those people with jobs, to be able to travel after the health crisis is over, but we may not see the same level of international airline mass tourism that we've seen in the past. Interesting to find out. So the effects on tourism, I've mentioned some of them. In Australia, there are a whole heap of things that are being talked about. A lot of them are related to the government trying to make arrangements to solve individual problems. So one of the problems in Australia is that we have a lot of temporary work visas. These people, often young people, may come from countries and they are traveling. So they may be counted as tourists, but they will also be working part-time. That's a significant influence on our agricultural industry, for example. And so the government is struggling to work out how to deal with those temporary work visas. So one of the effects of COVID. International students are another, well, they tend to be counted in the tourism numbers, and the situation for international students in Australia is pretty difficult because they tend to fall through some of the cracks between employed, unemployed, Australians, temporary migrants, and so on. So the situation for international students is that, I suppose, as around the world, many people are developing online courses as a stopgap. That's what we're seeing in Australia. Cruise ships are another area that's been significantly affected by the virus. In Australia, we've seen some examples of particular cruise ships which have had numerous cases of the COVID disease, and those passengers being released into Australia without adequate vetting, leading to lots of consequent infections and, in fact, some deaths. So that's a big issue for us. Accommodation. The only good thing you can say about accommodation at the moment is that there is some accommodation being used for quarantine. So there may be some government-funded income for accommodation, but in most situations it's pretty dire. Occupancy rates might be around 5–10%. Our transportation sector, we had a free market in aviation introduced by the government in the 80s. Two airlines, mainly Virgin Australia and Qantas Jetstar. Virgin, which is the smaller player, has gone into voluntary administration, and down the track that will have a big effect on regional tourism in places like Cairns, Central Australia, and so on. So another big effect. And even today I saw, I'll show you that, sorry, so an example I'll show you later is how the government is even having to try and deal with animals in zoos and aquaria and attractions to provide some income until the situation can be resolved. As an example, just compared to previous SARS in 2003, this is a graph showing the receipts in 2002 in US dollars, US $1 billion in China. Now, it's a long time ago, these are US dollars, but just give you an indication. So the whitish line, the top line, is 2002. As you go into SARS in 2003, after March, the black line shows that there was a pretty significant fall. followed by maybe 4 or 5 months later, a pretty substantial recovery. So that I think the total impact of the total fall at that time was around about $1 billion or so. Now, if we compare the market in China in 2003 doesn't compare in any way to the size of the market in China now. In one country, there would be tens of billions of dollars of effect, China. And if you multiply that by countries around the world, there's no comparison. And I don't think that we can therefore anticipate that the recovery will be as short as what you see in this paper. Cruise ships, as I said, copped a bit of a hammering. My favorite line is floating Petri dishes. Surprisingly, again, a report, and you never know where these reports come from. It's hard to suggest, but there is talk that despite the problems, bookings for cruises in 2021 are remarkably strong. So this issue about tourism is always seen as something which is affected by lots of factors, and it is. But the other strange thing about it is that it is a remarkably resilient thing, and people like travel, and we'll talk about that later. Susan Aquarium, just as an example of the large impact of COVID on various sectors of the economy. The zoos and aquariums are without money at the moment, and the government of Australia is seeking to provide at least some sort of grant for animal food over a 6-month period. So lots of things that are happening which you wouldn't normally be thinking about. All right, so the future, what do we think? Again, a bit of a trawl through the available information at the moment. There was a report by some colleagues at the University of Queensland, reported in the paper or online recently, last couple of days, saying that a survey of Australians suggests that 50% of Australians want to travel domestically when restrictions lift. I think this is indicating that there is a bottling up of demand, which suggests that travel of some form will return in future once we can travel again. And even Tourism Australia, which is the international marketing board, is starting to redirect its advertising to encourage Australians to travel within Australia, as well as to other countries. Well, to Australia and to return to Australia, I think. So there's a response by government marketing, rather than attracting people from people who live in other countries to Australia. They're saying in the immediate future, we need to be promoting Australia to Australians. So what does that mean? Well, depending upon this is a map of Australia. I hope you know, and I like to say that Queensland is the best part of Australia. So I'll be talking about Queensland and places like the Gold Coast and the Great Barrier Reef and Port Douglas and Cairns. So Queensland's an interesting place, a very attractive place to travel. At the moment, our borders are closed, so we can't travel south to New South Wales. As the recreational travel is allowed, probably from tomorrow, then we will start to see short break or what they might call drive tourism. So travel with up to about an hour or 2 hours from the origin. So, and given that most of the people live in Brisbane, we'll start to see beach destinations in Australia, in Queensland, and I suppose reproduced in other states. So people will start to travel from the big cities to those traditional domestic short break destinations in the foreseeable future. Once air travel starts, and I'm sorry, I'm using the traditional Australian map of the world where Australia is at the top, and the USA and other places are at the bottom. So there's talk about given that New Zealand and Australia have a pretty good health situation, our curves are flattened, as they say. Probably the first thing that will happen is that in Australia, there will be travel allowed to New Zealand, and that will be reciprocal. So that that's what they're talking about. They're talking about an international travel bubble, and perhaps in future there may be some of these other bubbles in various parts of the world between countries, which allows some international travel. But of course, how the airlines handle that, the talk is that the cost of travel will be much more expensive, perhaps because there will be some new regulations about how many people can sit in a row, whether you can sit next to someone, and so on. Anyway, but for Australians, domestic regional travel, domestic travel within Australia, and then some international bubble travel looks like the likely future. I have done some work with one of my colleagues, Dr. Sari in Indonesia. She looked at the qualitative responses of about 100 Indonesians in Padang, which is in West Sumatra, to the COVID lockdowns and things. The results seem to indicate that, as you might expect, travel will, these people are saying, well, we don't mind traveling, we want to travel, but we can't travel at the moment. The first key decision will be that the government allows us to. So until that time, travel, there won't be any. There does seem to be some indications of an interest in nature, perhaps because nature is associated with fewer people, as well as possibly because it seemed to be healthy. So there was some, when people were asked, where would you travel to? There seemed to be some interest in natural destinations, and perhaps less in traditional crowded destinations, because there was a fear that the disease would be lingering. Other interesting things that are happening in Australia. There has been, so this is from Tourism and Events Queensland, where there is an effort to match the promotion of tourism to the emotional state of the people of the market. So the idea is that you should keep communicating with the travel market, keeping your product in the eye of the potential traveler, and perhaps relate your message to how the people might be feeling. So as people start to think, well, maybe we should start to move on and think about travel, then you start to give them stories and messages, perhaps with an emotional basis, that encourage them to do that. There is a link to the information down the bottom there if you're interested. Another emphasis of the governments and the tourism industry is in the virtual world, delivering interesting social media, but also other forms of virtual travel, again, to keep the message in front of people and also to perhaps help to build demand a bit down the track. So there's a whole series of workshops and things for the industry going on to support them. Up to now, I guess the conclusion is that we should be well, the presumption, I suppose, around is that the best thing to do, of course, is to get back to the situation that we were in before all this stuff happened. And yet we do know that there are very serious issues related to tourism in a global sense. One of the main ones is the effect of CO2 emissions from long distance travel. It's a very significant effect. It's the major effect of the tourism industry as a whole on global warming, CO2 emissions, and so on. So I like this. This is a Chinese word. It is the word for crisis, and it's composed of two characters, threat and opportunity. So every crisis is obviously a problem, and that problem is happening now. If we starting to think about the future, there are opportunities if we choose to take them. This is some work I did 15 years ago. It's trying to think about how you can recover from an event, a disaster. You have a shock event. The effect is shown on the left-hand side. You have a line which is the system trend, how tourism has been performing. And generally the approach that people take is to look at how soon you can recover from the disaster and get back to the normal situation. So effective crisis management means getting back to the situation you were at before as quickly as possible. There is another alternative, of course, and that is that you can actually get back to a new system, or get back to a system which is better than the one that you had before. What is that system? Are we thinking this way? Myself, I don't think that governments are thinking this way. They are just saying, no, we want the situation that we had before. We want it back now because we're losing money. It's true. And yet we can see, this is my hometown, Brisbane, Gold Coast. We can see that there are differences in a world where there's less transportation. This is, of course, the effect mostly of car transportation, but it has reduced nitrogen dioxide emissions. And when I look out the window, I see a much clearer environment. It's good. Maybe there's some lessons for us. Because you see, the thing for me is that I would like to compare this situation that we're going through with COVID with another crisis that's also happening at the same time, and that is the environment. So we know that there's a problem with the environment, and we know that there's a big crisis in health with COVID. It's fascinating to look at the differences of responses of governments to both those crises. COVID, because it affects people now and the voters today, has been, the result is $1 trillion expenditure on health and safety. But if we look at the environment, arguably the problems of global warming are more significant and will affect the world in much more difficult ways, although not today. And the way governments treat the environment is that they say, oh, that's not our responsibility, that's an individual blame problem. Governments have no responsibility for the environment. You individual people need to change your habits. Good. But when you have the same effect in a health situation, they don't say it's an individual blame problem. They say, no, this is something where the government has to take strong action, and arguably $1 trillion. Those two situations seem unbalanced to me, but I don't see much discussion of that, which brings me to an opportunity for you. So I and another colleague, Dr. Ana Cláudia Campos from Portugal, have got a special issue that we're developing. It's in a open access journal, which means that you have to pay money for publication, unfortunately. But perhaps if there's any academics or other people who are interested, they may wish to turn their mind to thinking about what the future tourism experiences, the future sustainable tourism experiences will be like after COVID. Okay, so I think that's pretty much everything I wanted to say. I hope it's been interesting for you, and looking forward to questions after Alexandros has spoken. Thank you.
Thank you, Noel. That was very interesting indeed, very inspiring contribution to this webinar. And I'm sure there will be many questions for you in the end of the presentations. So our last speaker is Professor Alexandros Paraskevas. And over to you, Alex, when you're ready. Are we experiencing any technical problems?
His mic is mute.
Your mic is mute. Yes, you can't hear you.
Yeah,
Thank you, Alex.
No, you can hear me, yes.
Yeah.
I'm almost there. Just bear with me for a second.
Yeah, sure.
Is that working?
Yes, it is. It's very clear. Thank you.
Good. Okay. So my colleagues have talked about the problem from a macro perspective, from a government perspective, from global initiatives, and I would agree with everything that they say, but I will give another take from a more business perspective and what businesses can do realistically. So in the last few months, we hear, we read, and we write a lot about unprecedented times, and indeed, we live unprecedented times. But the cause of the crisis we live is not unprecedented. And Noel alluded to it. Well, actually, it was very clear. We have seen before SARS. Here in UK, we have seen foot and mouth. We have seen avian flu, swine flu, Ebola, and the Zika virus. But these health crises did not cause unprecedented times. Now, one reason is probably, and I agree 100% with Noel, that these were kind of geographically contained. And also, they did not affect the so-called Western world. But as you know, the only situation similar to what we live was about 102 years ago when we had the Spanish flu all around the world. And it's interesting to see what the newspapers were saying at that time. It's even more interesting to see what were the responses. If you take a look here, it's cover, cough and sneeze, avoid crowds. And then the reactions of the governments, again, were all about closing schools, no services in churches, funeral bans, and so on. So how come we were so unprepared for COVID-19? Where was our pandemic planning? Oh, also here, wash your hands. Wash your hands. Here in UK, wash your hands. Our prime minister, this is what he was saying. So what did we do wrong? I have been working with the hotel
Sorry,
industry on
Alex.
crisis plan.
Sorry, Alex,
Yeah?
I have to interrupt you. There is a cracking noise in the back. Can you
Yes.
just check your microphone?
My microphone.
Yeah.
Yeah. Can you hear me? Is there still this noise?
No, there isn't. That's lovely. Thank you.
Okay. So like, as I was saying, I have been working with hotel industry for on crisis since 2006. And we had pandemic planning at that time because of SARS and because of the avian flu. And we developed those plans. But where did we go wrong? I had an idea, but then I wanted to go back to some academic work that Ian Yeoman has done with Uma McMahon and Steve Page on pandemics. And they have done scenario planning for Visit Scotland at that time for pandemics, and everything was there. So there was a scenario one, which was saying the pandemic is out there, the virus is out there, and then scenario two, the virus is here in Scotland, and what do we do? And they looked at impact, they were proposing actions. So again, question is, what went wrong? And I found the answer in the conclusion of this paper, which says, some cynics will say that the flu pandemic is best treated like the millennium bug, something everyone got very worried about, but did not actually happen. And they were warning, unfortunately, the flu pandemic is much more serious than the millennium bug. The same thinking was exactly the thinking of the people I was working with, top executives in tourism boards and in hotel companies. They were saying that at the worst, a pandemic, a flu pandemic, would be a regional pandemic, but it will never happen as at a global scale. And this is where we were caught unprepared. So what happened was that in our pandemic plans, what we were looking at is at this. You know, this is happening, then a miracle occurs, and then we will get away with it. However, I think that we didn't manage to do that. No miracles here. And I have to say and admit that I myself was convinced that this scenario was only a scenario and would never happen. In fact, early March, just before the lockdowns, I was very much looking forward to my holidays in Sardinia, Italy. And I was in Trinet, the forum, and I was looking at the reactions of some of my colleagues in Italy, and I was a bit baffled. And thank God, Rodolfo Baggio, who is in Lombardy, and also Rita Canas, who is in Sardinia, in Cagliari, actually opened my eyes to the reality, because they were living this situation on the ground, not from a high level where I was myself. So they brought me back to my senses. So what now? While most of the hospitality, travel and tourism businesses are looking forward to a new normal, they begin the journey from totally different starting points. There will be probably a tiny minority who are fortunate enough here to have impacted not very much, although they haven't prepared for anything. There will be probably a tiny minority, which I call prudent, that had done some preparation for such a situation, but again, had not been impacted as much. And then the majority of businesses will be here, as Sonia said, you know, on a reactive mode. And they will have, all of them, to move to this quadrant up to become more proactive. Instead of wait and see and hope for the best and asking why, is they would have to go more to a scenario planning, prepare for the worst, and the question that they should be asking is, what comes next? and not only what comes next, but what comes beyond next. So what they should be doing is start working on building their resilience, as again, very well said by Sonia and Noel. And how do they do that? I have identified 7 blocks. And I think that the first point, which also was mentioned by colleagues, was the first thing that we should be looking at is look first and foremost about look after our people, their employees. The businesses need to look at their employees, safeguard their safety, protect their health and well-being, cement their trust with the leadership, okay, and not actually betray them by firing people indiscriminately or furloughing if there is no need. Big question, why does British Airways have to fire 12,000 members of its staff? Are they in such financial dire financial straits? And also boost their morale, help them actually go through the situation. Without them, they will not survive. The second step would be to look at their financial health and liquidity, take measures for now and the future, and make sure that moving to number 3, they fully comply to regulations so that they can be eligible for any government stimulus that is available, so that they protect their financial health. And then moving to 4, oops, sorry for that. I have to go up. Again, as Sonia said, look at the community and see how they can be of help to the local community, because this is the time where everybody looks at us, looks at us as business, looks at us as an industry, and how do we participate? How do we help the community in overcoming these difficult times? So this is very important. Then look at customers and their new needs. They will have new needs and expectations, and we need to develop a strategy not only to meet these needs, but if possible to exceed these needs. Moving on to number 5 is we need, before doing anything else, once we have agreed on what we want to be in the future, to transform our business accordingly. Transform our operations, train our staff, transform our supply chains so that we can respond, we can align our operation to the strategy that we have selected at number 4. An important element is also the use of technology and information security. Now we have all moved to online discussions, online conferences, online teaching. Some universities would not consider online teaching, and all of a sudden now we have moved to that space. We cannot go back. We will need, because our customer base will be used to this new norm, and we have to continue. We have to take a leap towards technological advancements, but this leap has to be also coordinated with the right safety and security procedures in terms of information. Most of the businesses, tourism businesses, when they will recover, they will face a wave of cyber attacks. Now they are not interesting targets because they don't have any business. But then they will recover, then cyber criminals will start really taking serious interest on them. And finally, as again, colleagues and Sonia said, risk management. Risk management has to regain, or to gain at last, a position in the mindset of business people. When I was approaching people about risk management or crisis management, especially hoteliers, they were saying, you know, general managers, oh, I don't need crisis management advice. I deal with crisis every day. Now I think that they might need to change a little bit their approach. And actually, not only that, it's not just risk management, but actually start thinking about insurance. Because in the future, insurance will kind of guarantee a smoother reaction to what we are going through now. So, on the way to this recovery, there are certain factors that we need to consider. And the main factor that we need to consider, I think, is at last try to learn from the past. And what we have in the past is this. The similar situation to what we are living now is the Spanish flu. But where we are now is we are somewhere here, right? We hope that we will not have a second wave, and even better, a third wave. But shouldn't we take into consideration that there may be a second wave, and the second wave, as you see, was 5 times more lethal than the first wave. And the third wave was twice as lethal as the first wave. So perhaps in all our planning, we need to take into consideration that one scenario could be this, and take the measures now for that. We talked about global scenarios and global solutions, but before we reach the global recovery, we have passed the seasonal disruption, and we are now at the stage of the prolonged disruption. But there will be, between now and global recovery, whenever this happens, an uneven rebound. And I say uneven because different countries will be affected in different ways. Australia, for example, as Noel said, have, what about 55, you said, deaths, Noel? Yeah, I cannot hear you because you are muted, but yes, around this area. All right, whereas here in UK, we're experiencing more than 22,000 deaths. All right, and in Italy and Spain, thousands and thousands of deaths. And in America, even worse. All right, so these economies and these countries will not be able to rebound in the same way together. The developed countries will rebound perhaps faster. The developing countries will have a delay. So factors that we need to consider is when we're thinking about tourism of the future is that what is our status in our destination, the one that we are operating, and then what is the status in the markets that will feed us tourists? What the number of spread and cases will be different. The level of their economies will be different. Supply chains will be operating in a different way. Travel restrictions will be different. And then again, international meetings. Are they going to happen? When they are going to happen? How they are going to happen? We're talking about the Olympics. The Olympics were postponed, and now there is an idea that they may be cancelled. And also other factors about political stability and pressure to the governments, about security, local civil unrest, perhaps political violence, and also geopolitics. Sonia mentioned before about the Chinese virus and how it is acceptable to call it Chinese virus, but we have the President of the United States talking every day about the Chinese virus. So how can this, what effect will this have in the overall recovery? But most importantly, what we need to think, and this is probably the holy grail that will save tourism, is treatment. And what is the progress on treatment? What cures, therapies are we going to have, and how fast about the virus, on the virus? When this vaccine will be developed. So these are factors that, again, we need to consider very seriously when we are talking about going back to some kind of normality. So the question is, can we have big tent solutions for travel and tourism, global solutions? My argument is that we can have global initiatives, such as the ones presented before by colleagues, and national initiatives, but then it's, again, on the local businesses to see how they are going to apply this at the local level. The first thing that I could see is to develop collaborative networks. And again, Sonia alluded to that. Through these collaborative networks, we can harvest learning about how to deal with this crisis, how to deal with similar crises, how to deal with crisis in general. This collaborative network can seek expert advice, and experts have been dissed, as the term goes, recently, especially in this country, but also we can see in the United States, very much by governments. And I think that the expert advice is needed here. We have to use support networks, and businesses have to focus first on their transformation, how they are going to transform themselves for the new normal, and then on recovery, so that everything goes hand in hand. So I would say, yes, global initiatives, but local solutions. So local solutions informed by these global initiatives. And test, experiment, and then share best practice. So as everything comes from the Asia, it started in Asia, but also the rebound is going to come from Asia. We have quite a few examples from Asia in terms of what I just said. So first example is luxury hotel chains in Hong Kong have come together, this collaborative network that I was describing before, and you can recognize some really serious brands there. And they have formed what they call heritage tourism brands. Purpose is to share knowledge, share strategies in order to recover, but also to have built some muscle in future decision making about tourism, so that they can have a strong say. And this is very important in collaborative networks. And think that these companies are killing each other, were killing each other in under normal circumstances for market share. Technology, you know, the self-check-in kiosks, but these will become more and more important in travel. Currently, there is experimentation for facial recognition, actually application in certain airports, so that you can just show your face and get information about your flight. Scary, they will say some, but not. This is technological progress. And Gatwick, a few months ago, was experimenting on onboarding, not coming out, for border control, but onboarding using facial recognition. The experience will change. Here you can see the security officer saying, no, you don't need to give me your laptop anymore or your iPad, because this here is not an X-ray machine, it's a CT scanner, like a medical CT scanner. So the controls, the safety checks will be done with CT scanners. And this is Schiphol, the Amsterdam Airport, International Airport. So it is there. And who knows what will happen with health checks in the future. So companies are actually trying different things. They are communicating with their customers, their passengers here. American Airlines is actually saying what they are doing in order to disinfect and sanitize the cabin and different points of touch points. They are trying different policies, as for example here, that all passengers have to bring a face mask and they have to carry with them a hand sanitizer. This is from the Ghana Health Service standards, in Ghanaian airlines. Other airlines like JetBlue will require passengers to wear masks, but American Airlines will provide face masks and sanitizing wipes for passengers. So these are the changes that I was describing before. Some companies go to many lengths. Here we have Air Asia introducing new uniforms for their staff. Okay, but also with regards to social distancing, there may be changes in the way that the cabins are structured. Okay, so looking back in the middle and protective plexiglass around the passenger. So things will change. Here in hotels, in a hotel in Hong Kong, we have robots doing room service. And again in Asia, companies introducing educational programs for front office managers to deal with smart technologies. So in conclusion, what I would say is someday we will all die, as Charlie Brown says, and Snoopy responds, true, but on all the other days we will not. And on all the other days we will be traveling. So tourism will rebound one way or another, and we will find a way to get over this hurdle again. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex, for your inspiring contribution. Brilliant. Well, thank you all for your fantastic contributions today. So we'll go now to our questions. And to the audience, just a reminder, please submit more questions for either Alex or Sonia or Noel. Okay, so our first question comes from George Triadafilou, and this is for Sonia, for you, Sonia.
Yeah.
Shall we save the planet or ourselves? Because the planet will remain to exist even without us. Will this crisis make us rethink our contact with nature, or after 2 or 3 years, everything will have been forgotten and no lessons learned? So go back to business as usual.
Yeah. The question is from
George Triantafilou. He's a
hello,
great
George.
colleague.
Yeah.
George.
Hello, George. Well, it's a very difficult question that you've asked again, like it's a dilemma. Should we save the planet or should we save us? There is no choice between the two. I think we are interdependent. The planet depends upon us and we are dependent on the planet. So we cannot say that I am more important than the planet is, you know. We have to save both the humanity and the planet. And if we are healthy and safe, then we can think of saving the planet as well. And if we are healthy and safe, we save the planet with the thought that if we save the planet, we will remain healthy and fit, you know, so it goes like a circle. I cannot choose between the planet and the people. Second part that you're asking is, everything, are we going to learn anything from us? Are we going to forget it? Again, I may be a bit sadistic here, but I think what happens is we always forget. The problem with humankind is man always thinks for profit after a while. Immediacy of situations makes him think for a while, maybe 6 months, maybe a year. But unfortunately, after a while, we tend to forget. So I hope we can learn some lessons from this. And I hope the lessons are not going to be temporary. I hope they can last. But I have my doubts about that. I cannot say, because research has proven time and again that people tend to forget because they are blinded by profit. They are blinded by their struggle for daily existence. So me, myself becomes more important all the time and we don't think about anything else. So that's my answer to your question.
Thank you, Sonia. So we have a second question here for Noel. And this comes from Craig Leith. I totally agree that there will likely be more stringent rules, codes of ethics, tourists taken on more ethical obligations, etc. However, the industry and society has very short memories and new good habits do tend to drift. How do we ensure these changes stay in the long term and are simply forgotten, not simply forgotten, as travel barriers come down and the industry and government aims to increase revenue as soon as possible? And that's for you, Noel. Yes.
There was a very interesting, I'll just talk around this for a minute. There was a very interesting example I came across. There was a car in a new model car that was produced in America. And it had the unfortunate characteristic that if it was hit from behind at speed, it would explode, killing people. It's very sad. But the car company at the time made the claim that it was not their problem. It was the problem of the individual. So they would use the argument that it was a individual blame problem. The blame for the explosion belongs not to the company that makes it, but to the way it's driven. So that's an individual blame solution. Of course, the alternative is a system blame. That is, the system which produces the cars is actually the one that's responsible. The person may be using it badly, but that's really a problem of design of the car. And so we have always two reasons for why a problem is occurring. We can blame the individual, or we can blame the system, the people who produce it. And so in the case of the environment or COVID, same problem. Some countries are taking an individual responsibility approach. People in Australia talk about Sweden and how they're saying that that individuals are responsible, and other countries are taking a more of an approach where the government is responsible. Now, it is true that individuals always change. They're always forgetful. And as they change in their life, they'll move on and adopt new rules. But the purpose of a government is to avoid that problem. The purpose of a government is to institute rules which direct behavior in a systems approach and make sure that those rules aren't lost. The behavior doesn't change over time. So I would say that if you want to have good habits, what's the problem? Well, you can say, well, the habits need to be introduced individually. And if the individual person forgets about it, then, well, we've got an individual blame, it's their problem. But if it's serious, governments seem to take a system blame approach. They adopt their systems, they change the way they work in order to make sure that that doesn't happen again. Examples include tax, armies, and COVID-19. So most of the governments are taking a systems approach. I would say they need to take a more systems approach in some way to implementing these ethical obligations of some type. And that's how you might ensure that it happens. Thank you.
Thank you, Noel. Okay, we have got here a question for you, Alex. And this comes from Carlos Costa.
Yeah.
As you said, this crisis is global, not local. So don't you think that the crisis may stay longer than other previous crises because other continents and countries, other countries will be affected by coronavirus much later? So how do we solve this problem?
Well, we don't solve this problem. This is a fact. This is a scenario that we need to consider very seriously. So far, the virus has affected the northern hemisphere, but now seasons change, and the southern hemisphere is expected to be affected similarly as the northern hemisphere. Australia is lucky enough to be an island and had already in place protective measures for several infections brought from outside. But if other countries have not done so, and most probably they haven't, then we will have this, and it will stay with us for a while. This is what I think. How do we solve this problem is, yes, international collaboration, as mentioned before, in the sense that countries and tourism destinations and tourism businesses need to understand that this is not a one-off. This is not a SARS. This is not a Zika. This is going to last for a long time, and we need to adapt and adopt new measures and new ways of operating. Travel is going to change, and it is going to change. There were people who were complaining about Delta Airlines cramming, passengers in one flight, and they were saying, "Where is the social distancing here?" I think that at a certain stage, IATA will intervene, all the other airlines will intervene, governments will intervene, and they will say, "We have to change the way you travel." As they have intervened, and we had all those security measures that we didn't have 15, 20 years ago, the same thing will happen with safety and health now.
Yes, thank you very much, Alex. Now I have got a question here for all three of you. So this comes from Professor Dimitrios Bouharis. What conditions should we have to allow us to travel? Can I start with you, Alex?
What conditions? I think that it is the responsibility of the transport company, whether it is a cruise line, whether it is an airline, whether it is a bus or a train, to ensure health and safety. And safety is ensured in a way, and was at a primary concern for all those companies. I want to assume, I want to believe, sorry, but now health is going to become equally important. So the CEO of Delta Airlines, a couple of weeks ago, when he was talking to investors, he predicted that the normal level of trade will not bounce back before at least 3 years. So he didn't expect that Delta would resume, its operations to the level that was at pre-COVID before 3 years passed. But what he said is that flights will be flying with a capacity of 65 to maybe 70% maximum, because health measures will have to be in place and social distancing will have to be in place even in aircrafts. So I believe that health will become a primary factor now, and we need to be very careful on how we handle it and how we communicate about it, not in a way that insults the intelligence of people, as some companies do, but in a way like, for example, American saying, this is what we are going to be doing. And not say that, we have partnered with this big clinic and now they have shown us how to clean, as if before you didn't have any responsibility for cleaning and now you needed just medics to show you. So this is a long answer for a short question. Sorry.
Thank you, Alex. Okay, can I ask Sonia for your reply to this, the conditions which would allow us to travel again?
Sure. Hello, Dimitrios. In my view, the strict conditions that should allow us to travel are probably conditions related to health and hygiene safety. And here I want to again say that though we see that maybe 40% of the travelers are themselves responsible and they consider it, they are educated, they move around in a very proper and accountable manner, there is 60% of travelers who just don't care. For this kind of people, we might even need to think of introducing penalties in case they are not following the strict rules of hygiene, health, and safety. So like I was just reading that Greece is now rethinking of opening the borders, and they are probably thinking of introducing an COVID immunity certificate or strict visa rules, or maybe hiking the visa fee. They want to limit the people. So I think the conditions should be related to health, hygiene, and health safety. And in case governments feel that people are not going to be responsible, then I don't mind going in for penalties for people who are not abiding to these rules and regulations.
Thank you, Sonia. Penalties. Okay. Noel, for you now, could you give us your reply to that question?
Yes, well, firstly, thank you, Demetrius. You always ask hard questions, and I'll pay you back one of these days. So, what are the conditions that we need in order to begin traveling again? Well, firstly, let's look at the situation across international borders. So that's a bilateral problem, or in fact, maybe even a multilateral problem. It's the government of Australia and the government of New Zealand or China or somewhere have to agree that flights are available, and there's health issues there, but there's also other factors. So government, hopefully that would be sorted out by the level of infections in each country and agreement on how they're handled. For example, if people got infected from COVID, an Australian got infected from COVID in China, would they be covered by insurance? Or they're certainly not covered at the moment by their travel insurance. So how would that be handled? So there's lots of bilateral issues about health and safety that would need to be discussed, and that's beyond my scope. In terms of within a country, I suppose it's there's the first, governments are controlling these things. So the government has to firstly allow people to travel, and that's the first issue. After that happens, then it's demand, and I think that demand within a country will probably pick up reasonably quickly, excepting for the financial position that people find themselves in. So there's two sides of it. One is demand will pick up because people want to travel. The downside is, although people want to travel, they don't have enough money on average. So demand will pick up in some segments, the higher income segments, quicker than the low income segments, and companies will respond to that. So I don't quite agree with Alexandra, sorry, in terms of comments that it should rely on the company. I think in this particular case, it will rely upon government regulations and should do that. Ultimately, we're dealing with health and safety, and the reason why companies have the health and safety requirements or the health and safety systems they have at the moment is generally because governments have insisted on them in the past. So now we've got a new situation. Governments will insist on things, industry will follow. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Noel. So I've got one more question for all three of you. May I start with you, Noel? The fear in a traveler's mind is inevitable considering the current situation. Yes, there are webinars happening to educate the traveler. However, how do we boost up the confidence of travelers since vaccination is still currently not there yet? And this comes from the Banki Circle.
Well, hello, Debanki, and thank you for a difficult question. I think that you can't. I don't think, as I'm saying, I don't think this is something that an individual company or an individual business can do. Ultimately, what's happening is people's desires to travel or interest, ability to travel, is not in their control. It's in the control of governments. And so governments have created the fear, if you like, or created the laws that say don't travel. That's where all the information is. Until that changes, then people won't travel. If the government of Australia says, as it has tomorrow, you can travel for 50 kilometres, well, people will travel 50 kilometres. And so I don't think that's an individual business, it's a government responsibility.
Okay, Sonia, could you?
Yes, I would like to say that. Well, there is. It's going to take a long time to really know when this problem is going to be over, and still, again, there will be no. We can't really put a stamp on it that now it is over, because it will be lingering on for a very long time somewhere or the other around the globe. So to now again restore the confidence of travelers. There's really, like Noel said, of course, once the country is open, their borders, people will start traveling. Once within the country, the state borders are open, people will start traveling. Now, let me just mention one thing here. I was just doing some reading the other day, and there's some research on risk-averse travelers. There's a whole group there which are risk-averse travelers who really, okay, at the time there was a lot of hue and cry about this situation, so people are not traveling and there are lockdowns. But once it opens, maybe I'm a risk-averse traveler. If I have to go for a conference or if I have to go somewhere, I'll just pack my bags and go. I mean, there is a group of people who will travel, and maybe if they travel and come back safe, the others can be motivated. So I can't say that we can put a stamp on, okay, now it's all over, you can travel. No, it's for the individual to decide when he wants to travel, and it's his determination to travel. Like I said, I fear that as soon as the lockdowns are going to be over, the first place which is going to see hordes of people is going to be your restaurants and takeaways, and people want to just go out and maybe eat somewhere. So they're not going to think twice whether it's going to be hygienic or not hygienic. Even in Australia, I was reading the other day, the beaches were let open and all the people were going out surfing, and they were lined up after McDonald's, and what I have been craving to have this McBurger for a while, so they don't really care. So it's on the individual's determination. You really can't see, and the ones who are really scared might just stay back, but the others are going to travel.
Okay, thank you, Sonia. And Alex? We can't hear you, Alex. Your microphone is on.
Sorry. I agree with Noel about the role of the government here. To the extent that there are travel restrictions, international travel or national travel restrictions. The question is, how do we combat the fear of the traveler once these are lifted? So I would take a dual approach here. If we're talking about business travel, then the responsibility of taking this fear off the traveler lies on the employer, who is sending his staff wherever they are sending them. And there are a number of ways that this can be done: through training, through insurance, through a Corona Pass, for example, that was introduced, an electronic Corona Pass, like the certificate that Sonia was saying, that an electronic Corona Pass, which was introduced by a company called Bizagi a couple of weeks ago, and then Ernst & Young, one of the biggest consulting companies, has made it a policy that all its traveling employees will have to have this Corona Pass. So I think that the employer's responsibility to take the fear out of travel when it comes to business travel. And I think that it is then the business responsibility to convince leisure travelers that if they travel with this particular airline and if they stay to that particular hotel, they are safe. So that's how we can lift the fear up. And there is speculation that, for example, Airbnbs will be more popular in the future among business travelers because they have introduced this new approach of 72 hours blockage of the apartment before a traveler arrives, and 72 after that they depart, and there will be disinfection and all that stuff. So if you gain the trust of the traveler, then the fear will be overcome.
So it is this issue of trust you're telling us.
Absolutely, yes.
Thank you. All right, we've got a question here for Sonia.
Yeah.
Yeah. What should developing countries do to save the tourism supply chain that clearly have other problems such as political sanctions? And this is from Raza Bahadouri.
Hello, Raza. This is again a very difficult situation because developing countries are anyway burdened with innumerable problems. But I think, tourism supply chain is extremely worst, extremely worst. Coming from a flower arrangement to floriculture industry to where we're getting the food from, food and beverages, we cannot have a strict control over the whole supply chain. So to save the supply chain, it is for the government and an industrial body like, we have a confederation of industries here. So for them, they need to devise some kind of rules and regulations, and they need to devise some kind of protection for all the affiliated industry partners. Only then we can we will be able to save the supply chain. For a single independent entrepreneur who's running a small business, nothing in his own control. So it can only be done at the government level under an umbrella body. That can secure the interests of businesses, and it can secure that in case such a disaster occurs, the supply chain keeps running.
Thank you, Sonia. Okay, we've got a question here for Noel. And this is from Danis Ali. Countries are focusing primarily on reviving domestic tourism, but what should be the strategy to revive international tourism, since it is a major foreign earner, and you can play a major role to boost economies?
Well, yes. Danish, thank you for the question. What can they do? What can a country do to boost international travel? In Australia, what is happening is the government is trying, every country is different, I imagine, but in Australia, most of our international travel, in fact, 99.9% comes by air. So protecting the international markets or international travel is dependent upon airlines. So the governments are trying, the government of Australia is trying to support the aviation sector with some economic, with some funds to keep them ticking over, to keep them, to keep the companies alive. It hasn't worked with Virgin Australia, in part because that company was trading poorly for several years. With the other major character, Jetstar and Qantas, the government is working to maintain a minimum standard of service, even though it's not probably economic at the moment, and is supporting routes to regional areas as well. So support the airlines. I think the other thing is and probably this is more relevant in countries in Europe and other places, to try and maintain the international market within a particular area. So this is the bubble idea. Try and find some countries that are close by that you can both win by having international travel between you. Apart from that, it's not an issue. See, this is the thing. It's not an issue that governments have any control over. That it's an issue that's outside their ambit of responsibility. It's about a health system or that is unprecedented, and that's why this health the effect on industry across the board will be severe. International travel will probably be the last one to come back. I don't know if I have any major other good news for you, but perhaps Sonia or Alexandros might be able to help me out here.
Sonia, would you like to add anything to this question? It is a very hard question. Your microphone is off. So your microphone, you're on mute.
What was the question? Can you repeat it, please?
Oh, yes.
It was something about domestic tourism.
Yes.
Oh, countries, yeah, I got it. Are focusing primarily on reviving domestic tourism, but what should be the strategy to revive international tourism, since it is a major forex earner and can play a major role? Hi, Danish. Danish, I think at the moment, unless and until, like Noel said, the countries open up their doors for international tourism is going to be very difficult. And the other way, like I was talking about, is that for the travel agencies and the tour operators now to decide with which markets they would want to open up, because there is a lot of xenophobia that is attached to travel right now, and certain countries have been stigmatized. So the doors will open up for international tourism, but it will take some time. And it is the decision, I mean, even if the government opens up the doors for international travelers, how many will come in and how many are ready to go out in international travel is something that nobody can guarantee. So,
okay, thank you. And Alex?
Yes, with regards to the level of control that the governments have in international tourism, of course, travel restrictions, border controls and all that are within the control of the governments. But let's say that, these are, we go back to normalcy. I think that perhaps in the new era, international travel will be quite susceptible also to geopolitics and political decisions. There is a risk there, and I don't know if my colleagues share this, but for example, with travel advisories, with strict travel advisories, they can have control, at least at outbound tourism, outbound travel in general, and tourism, of course. So if, for example, countries decide that they are going to sanction China, as it is discussed, for this virus, I can easily see the United States starting first to say every travel to China is banned, whether for business or for tourism or whatever. And then there will be retaliations, and then there will be the allied countries that will develop similar restrictions and similar policies, and then tourism and travel and tourism can become a battlefield, a political battlefield. So there is a risk there, and we don't know how this will be played out.
Yes, thank you, Alex. And our next question comes from Dimitrios. Well done, Alex.
He likes me.
Yes, he likes your responses, I think. How would it change business models? Who do you see survive and who will become bankrupt? Survival of the fittest, is it?
Exactly. But perhaps it's time to dispel what Darwin meant when he said survival of the fittest. When he said the fittest, he was not referring necessarily to the strongest,
No.
not fittest like this, but the one that is able to adapt to the new conditions.
Yes.
So as I insisted in my presentation, and I cannot make it stronger, I think, first businesses need to transform themselves to adapt to the new normal, to what we call the new normal, and then start the recovery process. So the ones that will survive will be the ones that will be able to adapt. Now, there are some businesses that will not be able to adapt. There are some businesses that, for liquidity purposes and, cash flow and all that will be bankrupt. What will happen, what I see happening is a restructuring of tourism in general. And looking at the hotel sector, for example, I will see more and more independent hotels developing collaborative networks, joining bigger hotel chains in terms of distribution and in terms of standards and all that, because they will need to have access to the know-how and transform themselves. There will be consolidation in the industry because we are a fragmented industry in general. Travel and tourism is fragmented. As we saw, for example, in 9/11, before 9/11, there were 19 airlines in the United States. After 9/11, there were only 4. Okay, so I think that we will see changes, not only smaller players being absorbed or merging or whatever, but also the bigger players will start looking at mergers and acquisitions. So it will be, the post-COVID environment will be a field day for lawyers for mergers and acquisitions, I think. And business models will change, will have to change.
And well done again from Dimitris. Thank you very much, Alex. And I'm taking now our last question that comes from Vanessa. And this is for all. What do you think are the roles of tourism researchers and for students in tourism and sustainability in the face of the crisis? Can I start with you, Sonia?
Sure. Hi, Vanessa. Vanessa, I think what we are doing right now is a webinar dealing with such kind of problem. So the first role of researchers, we're all researchers here. I'm not a great professor or a great academician. We're all researchers still. And one role through these webinars is to, deliberate about these problems, because academicians sometimes have excellent views to offer. And if these views are heard, so researchers can be in a brainstorming session, and they can provide some, novel ideas to resolving problems. And as far as students are concerned, probably their research can concentrate on now identifying through a history of how such disasters are tackled, so that in future they can bring out some work so that the industry players can go through the research and they can be better prepared. They can take proactive measures for designing such risk management strategies in view of such situations. And they can also researchers can try to identify the response of customers to such kind of situations, and also identify if risk-averse markets exist in tourism and hospitality industry.
Thank you, Sonia. And can I invite now Noel to give us a reply to Vanessa's question, please?
Yes, thank you. And Vanessa, again, you get, I don't know if you're a tourism researcher or a student, but if you're a student, I'd give you good marks for asking good questions. I think that this comes back to what the role of a university is and what the role of tourism researchers are. And, there's a lot of debate about that. The idea that a tourism researcher produces academic papers and writes research proposals which get funded is the common sort of approach. I disagree with that. I think that, although I've written lots of papers, but I think that the role of a university is to educate the region, to develop links with industry, community and society to improve it. So that's the general, the general answer. And they should be training their students to do that. The specific answer is, I guess, to try and, tourism, surprisingly, I don't think is a very innovative industry. And usually when there's a big shock like this, you need new ideas, and maybe that's where the students can be thinking about demand, about innovation, perhaps even starting their own businesses to become the leaders of the future. I don't know.
Okay, thank you. And Alex?
Well, Vanessa, this is a very good question, as both my colleagues said. Let's start with what the tourism researcher is doing. The tourism researcher is trying to understand, explain certain things, certain phenomena, certain situations. So the research here in COVID, when we're talking about COVID, there are so many things that we do not understand. We cannot explain, and we need to explore them. So clearly, COVID presents a huge agenda of understanding, of need for understanding. And coming back to what Noel said before, it's, the researchers and consequently the universities, I don't know if it's the egg and chicken thing, responsibility to generate knowledge and understanding which is relevant to the sector that we as researchers or as academics are serving. So to the tourism sector in this particular. So I think that, the role of all as academics is to understand and generate knowledge about whatever phenomenon that we are exploring, and produce something that is relevant to the people out there who are actually working on a daily basis in the sector.
Thank you, Alex. Well, this has been another brilliant webinar. So I don't think we can take any more questions. The time is over. So before closing our fourth webinar, thank you all very much for joining us, and our three panelists, Professor Noel Scott, Professor Sonia Khan, and Professor Alexandros Paraskevas. Thank you so much for your brilliant contributions to this webinar. And I hope you have enjoyed it as much as we have. And our fifth webinar will take place on the 15th of May. So we'll send out details then. So there will be no webinars next week, but it will be the week after. Thank you very much once again, and take care, stay safe, and see you soon. Bye.